Good morning, everybody. That's interesting. Thank you, Dr. Carlson. That was more knowledge than I knew when I got AML, but I know most of it now 8 years later. So it was wonderful. But it's really, I'm going to talk about my experience. But the first thing I should say is when you're making all these important decisions, your brain is in a fog. So that's the most important thing to remember. But I'm still here. So things have gone well since the beginning. Okay, next slide. My name is Ralph Hills. My wife Dorcas is on the call and in the picture because without her, I wouldn't be here. I call it a three-legged stool. The right medication at the right time, the amazing AML specialist clinician, and then I think a caregiver is just very, very critical. We're in Connecticut, and the other good news is I'm 40 miles from New York City. And New York City, of course, is the home of some pretty big educational and research organizations that I count on. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is tell you about my memorable journey, the same 8 years that Dr. Carlson talked about the progress. And I was there at the beginning. And so at that time, the pharmaceutical industry made a big deal of me. What am I doing now? Things like this, and what were the keys to success? How did I get lucky enough to be here after an unlucky phone call? Next. So I had a regular routine physical in December of 2014, and a complete stranger called me, not my doctor, not anybody I knew. You have to go to the cancer center right away. I looked at the phone and I said, why are you calling? The doctor told me to call you and tell you to go to the cancer center. So we went to the local cancer center right here in Connecticut. And we have a very experienced, published oncologist, but he's not an AML oncologist. And he told me four things. He told us four things. You've got something called AML, an acute blood cancer, which I now know means fast growing. You're going to get the standard of care, whatever it was called, in 7 and 3 or 60 days. When I asked about the prognosis, very gently said, just go home and get your affairs in order, which I now know is the standard of, I guess, expression care. But the last thing he said is go to New York and get a second opinion. And so that's what happened. I go down and Dr. Robos told me I could use her name today. She's in Know AML. So I get to go to a specialist, but the bad news is another one of those tearful sessions. You're going to get 60 days of treatment. You're going to stay in our hotel because lots of bad things can happen. I want you to be close by. I can care for you. And finally I said, no, I'm not doing that. I want to go out to our local one, and don't want to stay in a hotel for 60 days because my life was gone. Our life was gone. My wife's supposed to stay with me. So we convinced her to come out to our local cancer center where we had an introductory tour. I was planning to start on Monday morning. We went to prior Wednesday, and amazingly enough, I saw my friend of 30 years lying there, and I said, how you doing? I knew he'd been sick for about 11 months. And he simply said, they put me on a last-ditch trial drug, and I'm giving up. So that sort of sank in, but I didn't know anything about trial drugs or clinical trials when I heard that. Now, we're going in on Monday morning for the chemo, but Sunday night from the ski slopes of Colorado, Dr. Robos called and didn't talk to me because I didn't answer the phone. We were huddled in our pre-chemo family session. My daughter took the call, and Dr. Robos told her she had run some extra tests that I didn't really know about because I didn't know what was going on, and that I had a mutation, which I didn't care about, but it was called IDH2, and that was our choice, but she might have discovered another option for us. And if you decided to do it, don't go to chemo tomorrow, go into New York. So we went into New York and met her associate. So on the train, I'm starting to think, what is a clinical trial? And all I knew was that clinical trial can be something you get or something you don't get. And the don't get is called a placebo. So I was going through my moral compass and saying, I really like to help everybody else, but I'd really like to get something that'll help me. So that was part of my decision on the train. Next slide. So we did compare both options, and I was pretty convinced after seeing my friend there and hearing other things and hearing go home and get your affairs in order that I was expecting about a 10 or 12 month lifespan. So what about this unknown new treatment? Well, go to the bottom there. Lots of paperwork. So what do? I'm in a fog. I've got my family with me. They're supposed to be the sharp-minded listeners, but I still got about an inch of paperwork thrust in front of me with a signature spot. So I signed it. And we elected this new clinical trial. And it was a nightmare because I was in bed for 6 months, neutropenic, C. diff, everything that spots on me, yellow eyes, jaundice, 4 or 5 extra drugs to combat all these other issues. And every 2 weeks we go into New York in the winter, and either in a car or on the train. And that was before COVID. It was interesting. If you wear a mask on a train, you usually get a seat because no one wants to be near you because they think you've got something. And the bone marrow extractions, the doctor didn't like to do it. It's part of the clinical trial protocol, so we had no choice. Strangely enough, I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't eat anything. Dr. Robos was questioning that. And I said, just go to your fireplace, take a tablespoon of ashes and try to eat them. And she said, okay, I got it. It got worse and worse. Nobody could visit. I finally had to use a walker to get around. And as I said, there was a lot of really old-fashioned, I guess, 2014 paperwork. There weren't any dashboards and things like that. Finances were not a problem because I didn't get paid, but I didn't get charged. So that was fine. Next slide. Now, amazingly enough, after all these terrible months, the AML blast started dropping. I knew they were at 70%. And in retrospect, people said, why didn't you not know you had AML till you had a medical standard? Well, for probably September, October, November that year, I started to feel old. I mean, I was 70, and so I just thought, oh, that's fine. So I never noticed anything, but I was having some too many blasts. Then it started to go down month to month. We'd go in, and my wife would get a 3 a.m. Report on the cell phone. That's when they sent them out, and she'd wake up at 2:45 waiting for that thing. And doggone it, if those numbers didn't start to go down, I didn't feel much stronger. But I had a meal in October of 2015, which was just amazing. And then I started exercising because I'd lost so much muscle mass. Then I was asked by Dr. Robos to give her presentation on progress in AML. We did that in the cancer center. Then I went to the drug company that did this, and I discovered 2 young people who had taken a different approach to treating this. They were about 40 years old, a man and a woman. I think one was a chemist and one was a biologist. And they gave me the impression that they weren't met with such, I guess people were skeptical about this. We presented to the entire company, and I got my first standing ovation at age 72. And I realized it wasn't because of my speaking or anything. It was because they're there and they're happy to see their drug working, and it was wonderful. I did get one question that I'll never forget. One of the young people was just hired to market this new drug, and she said that was a very inspirational talk, but you had a lot of side effects. Do you think all those problems were caused by leukemia or our drug? So I only answered by saying I think there are people in this room that know more about that than I do. Next slide. So why was at the time, 2014 and 15, what was going on? Well, that 30-year-old standard of care that my friend was getting, you get all this chemo and everything, and pretty much debilitates your blood and marrow. And then you get someone else's good blood and you go back and forth. And I guess it's not up and down, it's down, down, down. But with this one and this slide, I didn't make this slide. The picking out those little flowers is exactly what this drug was doing. Next slide. So they were very excited and they just wanted me to come. So I'd go to all these drug company meetings. And this slide is, when I saw that, I said to myself, what a marketing genius did this, because they picked this particular flower because on the right side are those little buds. And those are the AML blasts that I was accumulating. From my understanding, and Dr. Carlson will know more about this, I was getting accumulated with blood cells that didn't do their normal cycle. They come, they grow up, and they die. So this flower on the left is the one that shows up for a while and then dies like a normal cell. And that's the patient's perspective on why they did this. And I thought it was a pretty good graphic. Next slide. So I'd go around and doing this, do this in a lot of different places. And I hate to say this, but not all the other speakers are still with us. So I'm not sure why I'm still around after 8 years, but the best I can do is try to give hope to others by just being an example. Next slide. This was out in Chicago. Somebody was out in Chicago actually finger painting this thing. It's like 6 feet wide, and the word advocacy is there, and that's what my wife and I try to do now. Next slide. The drug company, which has now been absorbed by another one, called and said, "Can we put a little picture of you in our annual report?" I said, "Sure." Well, who knew they would put me on the cover? Again, it's not because of me, it's because at the time, this was an exciting development in the industry. So it says 2017, and that's the year my drug was announced. I kicked it off in New York City at the launch meeting and gave my speech. And I will tell you, something funny happened. The CEO from the company I had already spoke to, he and his team were there also, and he came down later and he said, "You thanked us, you thanked the doctor, and you thanked your wife, but you forgot somebody." And I said, "Who did I forget to thank?" He said, "Yourself." And I said, "No, I don't need that thanks." He said, "But you don't understand, Mr. Hills." And he said at the time, only about 3% of clinical trials would be the initial treatment. It's usually after other things have not gone according to the best plan. And so I didn't want any credit for that, because remember my decision was 10 or 11 months versus, and then I met Dr. Robos, and so she wouldn't have called on Sunday night if she didn't think it was a good idea. So I threw myself luckily into the right hands. Next slide. I gotta move this. Okay, so it's about 300,000 families a year around the world. It's not breast cancer size. It's not anything else. And Dr. Robos is a big advocate of it. She has her own private, facility. So what's going on? And when you have 300,000 families, you got 10 people that are in each family that are really affected by this. It's a big deal. Why am I here? Well, my timing. When I was very young, there was a song in the 50s called Timing, and that's what I feel. I've been asked a couple times to help educate oncologists and what's the perspective of the patient for AML. So I got an AML specialist. If you have an oncologist and you have AML, you've got to get to an AML specialist. That's from the patient viewpoint. And all this new mutation testing and maybe personalized treatment. My IDH2 thing came around in 2017, and I think all the FLT3s and IDH1s, and there's so much more just came right after that. Now, the acceptance of clinical trials as a first, not only last ditch treatment. I don't know if other people would accept it, but as I told you, why I did it. But with the rapid changes and all this stem cell and this, people writing code to change mutations, I think it's just going to get more and more exciting, and almost everybody can get an analysis and get treated. I need to recognize my wife, Dorcas, because as Dr. Carlson said, there's so much more. I mean, there's picking up drugs, there's scheduling, there's driving, she gave up her whole life for 10 or 11 months now. She's already done that because we're just about at 50 years of marriage, so nothing new there. We try to give back, and I didn't realize I was just doing it because I thought it was the right thing to do, but 2 people have told me, "Do you think you're still left around a little extra time to give hope to others?" And I don't know. I'm also working on, and I did it at my first patient advocate comment in Know AML was years ago when I mentioned we need to digitize information that's out there. And now we're working on making sure there's no stack of paper for people. There's a digital signing up for clinical trial. There's digital reporting from home. There's telehealth. There's a lot of stuff that we can do to improve access to clinical trials. Next slide. So I do have two side effects. I have continuing, I have to manage my digestive tract, and also I've got neuropathy. And I wish someone would invent a cure for that. I've had it tested about 6 times, and they said, "Oh, you got it because you have leukemia." Yeah, I knew that. And this little thing we did last year when Know AML was focusing on diet, I said, "Well, I'll be happy to just use my poster for that." Next slide. And this is how I end my talks. This is, I have a really big dream. Every patient, and I've seen so much go wrong with older patients, different locations around the world. Everybody's going to have a different odds by what's available, but maybe that every patient, young and old, will have tests as a first step in a new standard of care, followed by approved precision medicines as an option or supplement to chemo. So that what we call treatments now might be called cures. Thank you very much. That's what I've been going through the last 8 years.
Ralph, if I may just say, that was a beautiful presentation. It was just eloquent and reminds me of why I do what I do. I thank you very much for sharing all of that.
Thank you, Karen.